You've heard the name, right? The Titanic. Over a century ago, a ship that was hailed as a true masterpiece of technology set sail on its very first, and as it turned out, its only voyage. It was meant to be a symbol of a new age, a floating palace. But in the freezing waters of the North Atlantic, that dream turned into an absolute nightmare. This is the story of the RMS Titanic, a tragedy that started with incredible human pride and ended by changing our relationship with the sea and with our own technology forever.
Wow. I mean, this quote from a survivor, Lawrence Beasley, it just says it all, doesn't it? It perfectly captures the pure shock that was felt all around the world. The whole tragedy, the central irony of the Titanic story is right there in that one word, unsinkable. That single idea, that overconfidence or hubris, is really the thread that runs through this entire disaster, from its spectacular launch to its silent grave 2.5 miles below the ocean's surface.
Okay, so to really understand the scale of this tragedy, you first have to get your head around the sheer size of the ship itself. At the time, this was the largest moving object ever built by human hands. But if you look at this chart, there are two numbers that tell a story all on their own. On one hand, you have the total complement, 2,208 souls on board, and on the other, the number of lifeboats, just 20. Now, believe it or not, that was actually more than the law required back then, but it was nowhere near enough to save everyone. And that one detail, tragically, would become the most critical of all.
All right, so let's set the scene. Part 1, the unsinkable dream. For the first 4 days of her maiden voyage, the Titanic was everything she was promised to be. I mean, it was a floating palace of luxury, and more importantly, it felt like a fortress of absolute security against anything the ocean could throw at it. From the incredible chandeliers in first class to the hopeful immigrants down in steerage, the feeling was one of total optimism.
So here we are. It's Sunday, April 14th. Survivors described the day with this eerie sense of peace. The sea was exceptionally smooth, almost like glass, but as evening came, the temperature dropped sharply, a pretty clear sign that they were entering a region with icebergs. Still, the ship just kept steaming ahead at nearly full speed. The sense of security was just unshakable. After all, what was a little bit of ice to the unsinkable Titanic?
Part 2, a quiet, fatal encounter. And this is what's so bizarre. The end didn't begin with a huge bang or a violent crash. It began with something so subtle, so deceptively minor, that for most of the people on board, it just passed by almost completely unnoticed. In the dead of night, this all happened in just a matter of seconds. The lookout, Frederick Fleet, saw this huge, dark mass right in front of them. He rang the warning bell and frantically called the bridge. First Officer Murdoch reacted instantly, but the ship was just too big and moving way too fast to turn in time. The iceberg scraped along the starboard side, and just 20 minutes later, the captain got the grim diagnosis. The damage was fatal. The unsinkable ship was sinking.
So, what did this catastrophic collision actually sound like, or feel like, to the 2,208 people on the ship? You'd imagine it would be this violent, ship-shattering crash, right?
Not at all. And this just shows how deceptive the whole thing was. Lawrence Beasley, a passenger reading in his cabin, felt only that, a slight shudder, a little heave, a dancing motion of the mattress. In the first-class smoking room, some men actually saw the iceberg glide past the windows. And you know what they did? They just went back to their card game. There was no panic, no sense of immediate danger, just a quiet curiosity when the ship's engines slowly came to a stop.
Part 3, order, courage, and confusion. So, as passengers were told to grab their life belts and come up to the boat deck, the reality of what was happening started to sink in. But even then, the response was mostly calm, almost disbelief. Many women actually refused to get into the lifeboats at first. They didn't want to leave their husbands behind, and honestly, they felt safer on the massive, well-lit ship than in a tiny boat in the middle of a dark, cold ocean. And on that freezing deck, every single one of these 2,208 people faced an impossible situation. Every one of them had a story, a family, a dream for the future that they were sailing towards. And this was the stark reality of their chances: 20 lifeboats.
Even if they were all filled perfectly to capacity, they could only save about half the people on the ship. The fate of over 1,000 people was sealed before the first lifeboat even touched the water.
And here is the tragic result. Only 705 people would be rescued. The huge gap between these three numbers tells the entire heartbreaking story of a catastrophe that was born from overconfidence and just completely inadequate preparation. Part 4, the final awful plunge. Now, for those who did make it into a lifeboat, their ordeal was far from over. From the darkness of the open ocean, they were now spectators to one of the most terrifying sights in all of maritime history, watching as the great ship met its end.
Dr. Washington Dodge, a first-class passenger, watched from his lifeboat. He described the ship's final moments, witnessing the bow sinking lower and lower, the lights suddenly blinking out for good, and then the final plunge.
Lawrence Beasley provides this haunting, unforgettable description of the sound. It wasn't an explosion like many people thought at the time. It was the sound of the Titanic's massive engines and boilers, each weighing tons, breaking free from their mounts and crashing down through the hull as the ship tilted almost vertical. A sound no one had ever heard before. In her final moments, the ship stood almost perpendicular to the water, this towering black silhouette against the stars, before she finally slid into the Atlantic. What followed, heard across the water by the survivors in the boats, was the sound they would never, ever forget. The cries of over 1,500 people left behind in the 28-degree water.
Part 5, a legacy forged in ice. The sinking of the Titanic was so much more than just a shipwreck. It was a profound blow to an entire era's faith in its own technological power. Its loss sent shockwaves of grief and, frankly, outrage around the world, and that public outcry demanded real, lasting change.
So what did we actually learn from this terrible loss of life? Well, the answer is that this tragedy led directly to some of the most important maritime safety regulations in history, laws that were written in the memory of those 1,500 souls.
First, the International Ice Patrol was created to track icebergs and warn ships, and it continues to do that to this very day. Second, the tragedy of a nearby ship, the Californian, not hearing the Titanic's distress calls because its radio operator was off duty, that led directly to the Radio Act of 1912, which made a 24-hour radio watch mandatory. And, maybe most crucially of all, the first Solace Convention was called, finally making it the law that every ship must carry enough lifeboats for every single person on board. These reforms have saved countless lives.
You know, the story of the Titanic remains such a powerful cautionary tale. It's a story about the limits of our technology and the real dangers of human hubris. And it forces us to ask, in our own modern world, with our own unsinkable technologies, have we truly learned the lessons that were forged in the ice that fateful night?